Man, I'm bored. Yeah, I know. This time of year just always gets me down, you know? When it's not snowing, it's raining. Then the rain freezes on the road and you can't go anywhere. It's too cold to go outside, it seems like everything fun is canceled for the season, and since everyone's going back to work, nobody has time to hang out. Ugh. I could do that. Or I could trick myself into thinking it's actually spring by talking about a game that's full of color and energy and life. Or I could talk about Pikmin and do both. Yeah, you heard me. Pikmin. Those two little syllables that are so dear to the hearts of Nintendo's biggest fans. Why, now that I think about it, there's a new Pikmin game coming out this year. I've got to get ready. And what better way to get ready for a new Pikmin than to remind myself of what was so great about the games of Pikmin past? Alright then, everybody. It's a new year, new possibilities, and this is a new Cinnamon Noir coming at ya. Appropriately enough for a science fiction-themed game, the original Pikmin was released in the year 2001, shortly after the debut of the Nintendo Gamecube. So soon, in fact, that it essentially served as a launch title. But the game has roots that go back a lot farther than that. The selling points of the original Pikmin, and really the whole series when you get right down to it, fit roughly into two broad categories, gameplay and graphics. Or, to be a little more descriptive, the game's unique mix of action-based and strategy-based challenges on one hand, and the beautiful, elaborate setting that the game takes place in on the other. Pikmin has been described as a real-time strategy game pretty much since it came out, and in this sense it harkens back to titles like Lemmings, in which you had to shepherd a bunch of small, dim-witted creatures to safety using their special abilities and your own common sense, and SimAnt, which put you in charge of an ant colony and tasked you with increasing their numbers while conquering traditional ant foes like spiders, the lawnmower, and especially the other ants that live in the yard. Those cursed other ants. How dare they be so different. Anyway, the other really unique aspect of Pikmin, and the one that I've spent a lot more time thinking about over the years, is the world building. When people said that Pikmin had beautiful graphics, it wasn't so much the GameCube's processing power that they were talking about as what it was being used for. The imaginative and intricately designed flora and fauna, which formed both the setting for the action and most of the participants in it. Lots of games from around the same time had graphics that, on a technical level, were as good as Pikmin's if not better. But what makes Pikmin stand out in this respect is how it frames and emphasizes its setting. Captain Olimar may be struggling to stay alive in a hostile alien environment, but he still takes time at the end of every day to jot down his thoughts, many of which have little practical value for the player. Since Olimar is the only character in Pikmin who speaks, these windows into his thoughts effectively set the tone for the entire game. When he's nervous, the player gets nervous. When he perks up after making progress, that also aligns with how the player feels. And when he expresses curiosity about how the Pikmin and various other creatures live, players are strongly encouraged to take an interest themselves. I think the best compliment I can pay to Pikmin's creature design is that it reminds me of a book I used to read again and again as a little kid called After Man by Dougal Dixon. After Man posed the question of what would happen to various animal species on Earth if humans were to go extinct in the near future, and it was full of illustrations and descriptions of imaginary fauna which the author presumed would evolve from present-day species under the influence of changing geographical conditions. What was amazing about these creatures was that they seemed so outlandish, even though most were only minor variations on animals that exist today. In many cases, the only really substantial difference was size. For instance, Dixon proposed that one branch of rodents might grow to occupy a niche currently held by deer, assuming that the deer would go extinct in a few million years. He called these rabucks, by the way. And while the creature design in the Pikmin series as a whole has gotten pretty weird over the years, Pikmin 3 in particular went kind of nuts with its enemies, what's striking about the original Pikmin is how down-to-earth and believable most of them are. Frogs, flies, clams. Heck, half of them appear to be some variety of beetle. Not unrealistic when you consider that about 40% of insect species in real life are beetles. It's as if Dougal Dixon had written a sequel that focused exclusively on bugs and vermin, a category which I have to say he didn't do much with in the original, maybe because they're seriously gross. But gross or not, bugs are still a major part of any ecosystem. And an ecosystem is exactly what Pikmin feels like it has. Each of the 3 large areas you explore over the course of the game is unique, not just in its layout and physical appearance, but also in the wildlife you encounter. Has it occurred to you, for instance, that there are no bulborbs in the forest navel? 𝘴𝘮𝘢s are pretty much the second most iconic creatures in the series, behind only the Pikmin themselves. They appear all over marketing materials, official art, the freaking title screen. But they don't appear here because a big bright behemoth with googly eyes simply wouldn't work with this cave-like level and its darker, more somber atmosphere. By contrast, in Pikmin 2 you find 𝘴𝘮𝘢s everywhere, not only in lots of caves, but also in every single overworld area. In contrast to the original game, Pikmin 2 seems to go more for what would be exciting or interesting in a particular area than what would fit in with the setting. The emphasis on caves really underscores this point. While many of the sublevels do have a unique aesthetic, they often have only a loose connection with each other, let alone the overworld which led to them. I think this is a big reason why a lot of people prefer the original Pikmin to its sequel. It's because, possibly only semi-consciously in some cases, they understand and appreciate the original's dedication to consistent theming. Pikmin is a short game, but that brevity is honestly one of its greatest strengths because it makes the game more focused. The levels are actually pretty small, but they're packed with enemies and puzzles in a way that makes them seem dense and teeming with life. No other game in the series has ever been this concise, and while that's not something everyone appreciates, it can be quite refreshing in an industry where so many developers try to cram a huge assortment of incoherent ideas into one project. I've heard a lot of people mention that the first Pikmin game is essentially a glorified tech demo, and in terms of how it was made, there's a lot of truth to that. But oddly enough, it doesn't feel like it in terms of how it plays. One thing I've never heard anyone say is that the game is too short, and that's weird because the game is really short. A playthrough of Pikmin is at most 6.5 hours long, and for experienced players, it's more like 5 hours or less. It's easy to see the features that other games have that the original Pikmin doesn't, but it's not so easy to see how a longer campaign or more content would make it better. For what it is, the design is practically ideal, which is precisely what made the issue of a sequel so problematic. You see, when I titled this video The Little Franchise That Could, that wasn't just a reference to a classic children's book. It was also the first half of a sentence that I deliberately left unfinished up to now. The truth is that Pikmin was a little franchise that could have stopped innovating and still been good. The original Pikmin was a moderate financial success, selling a little more than 1 million copies by mid-2002. Those aren't earth-shaking figures, but for a new IP on a console with less than stellar sales, it was noteworthy. It's only a little less than Mega Man 2 managed back in the NES days, and it had 4 sequels on that console alone. So a sequel was definitely a reasonable possibility for Pikmin. The bigger problem was that there was no obvious direction for a sequel to Pikmin to go in. Lots of sequels set themselves the task of fixing what didn't really work in the last game, which in the case of Pikmin was nothing. The most obvious move for Nintendo would be, well, to pull a Mega Man, make essentially the same game again, with different levels and some new enemies, recolor this, tweak that, but mostly keep the formula identical. I honestly believe that if they had done that, most fans of the original Pikmin would have loved the result. A new captain with new ship parts to collect, new insect enemies, and maybe a single new Pikmin type to shake things up? Cool. Interest in the franchise would have petered out eventually, just like it did with Mega Man, but in the meantime, Nintendo would have had a nice little moneymaker on its hands to supplement the real powerhouses like Mario and Zelda. It could have worked. But Nintendo doesn't do things that way. At least, they didn't do things that way 20 years ago. So Pikmin 2 would not turn out to be a safe, mild iteration on the original's design. Instead, it went in a bold, weird new direction, a direction which certain people, not to name any names here, really did not like. The first massive change that Pikmin 2 made to the original's design was structural. Gameplay was now split between overworld levels, which were sprawling but now contained relatively few enemies and challenges, and sublevels and caves, which contained a lot more enemies than in the first game. Gone were the intricate overworlds of the original Pikmin, salted liberally with individual challenges, which you could tackle one at a time in any order, to be replaced by linear sequences of cave sublevels, in which your biggest concern was just getting enough Pikmin through the gauntlet alive to face the next challenge. Each level in the original Pikmin featured a non-linear assortment of gameplay tasks, some of which led directly to prizes, while others led to more obstacles. But because so much of Pikmin 2 takes place in caves, the progression here is stricter and more oriented toward a direct one-task, one-prize relationship. There's much less of the indirect problem-solving that made the original feel strategic. There is a lot of player freedom in Pikmin 2, but it's under some heavy constraints. In the original Pikmin, only the very first day was set in stone. From day 2 onward, you make your own decisions and progress the way you want to. In Pikmin 2, on the other hand, there are a lot of things you have to get done before choices start to open up for you. Take a look at the way you find new Pikmin types in the two games. In the original, yellow Pikmin could easily be found on day 2. There's only a couple of dirt walls and a red bulb orb standing in the way. Blue Pikmin are similarly easy to find in the forest navel. Just look behind your ship after you land and hey, there they are! It's easy to find the onions because the game is eager to get you started on choosing tasks to complete. Non-linear games often work this way. They give you the tools you need right away because you might need them right away. Why do you think Breath of the Wild gives you all the Sheikah Slate spells you'll ever need before you leave the tutorial zone? But just as non-linearity is complemented by easy access to tools, structure is complemented by restrictions on how you use tools. So Pikmin 2 makes you jump through a lot more hoops to progress. Day 1 is a tutorial, just like before, but now Day 2 is a straight shot to a cave where you find purple Pikmin, with no optional side areas at all. Day 3 in the Awakening Wood is more open, with a few optional treasures to find, but the only direction you can move in from the start is toward the Hole of Beasts and the White Flower Garden. You need to get white Pikmin before you can open up the next area, the Perplexing Pool. So although the Hole of Beasts is technically skippable, the White Flower Garden is not. The next day, Day 4, is the first time in Pikmin 2 that you arguably get to choose your own path. And even then, things stay pretty restricted for a while. Finding the yellow Pikmin in the Perplexing Pool isn't simple. It involves using a set of scales to lift yourself up, fighting several pretty difficult enemies, and unrolling a bridge to make a shortcut back to your base. I've often found that I spend most of Day 4 just getting to the yellow Pikmin and building their numbers up a bit. So it's not really much of a choice how you spend Day 4 after all. Now let's assume you go back to the Awakening Wood on Day 5 to get blue Pikmin, in order to free things up ASAP. This is a little less complicated than getting the yellows, but it's still something that can take up most of the day. It's only on Day 6, which in gameplay terms is nearly an hour of overworld exploration after Day 2, that we can go anywhere we want in any level we want. Obviously, this isn't even mentioning how much time you spend in caves, which are the most linear part of the game, during all this. It's only after all these steps are completed, in order, that the game becomes less linear, although at this point it's still far from being non-linear, the way Pikmin was. And before these steps are completed, you don't have much to do besides the things that you have to do. Before you get blue Pikmin, the entirety of the Valley of Repose is locked off, except for the small starting area. In the Awakening Wood, it's impossible to reach the Snagret Hole, and much harder to get to the Bulblax Kingdom, which you're not getting in period if you don't have yellows, by the way. In the Perplexing Pool, no blues means no shower room and no submerged castle. We're talking about roughly 2/3 of the game here being totally inaccessible until you have all 5 varieties of Pikmin. So how does Pikmin 2 make up for imposing all these restrictions on the player? With variety. This game is stuffed to the gills with treasures, new enemy types, and different sub-level maps, not to mention the 2 new Pikmin types, each of which has multiple unique skills. If the original Pikmin was a refreshment table at a party, with a few sandwiches, some chips and dip, and drinks, Pikmin 2 is a 7-course banquet of game design, with unique wine pairings for each course, and a dessert at the end that I guarantee will make your mouth water. I'm not just being silly here. Think about it. At a party, you can go to the refreshment table whenever you want, take as much or as little as you want, and eat what you take however you want. There's not much, but the manner of presentation is 100% open. Meanwhile, at a banquet, you're sitting at the table as each course is brought to you. You don't decide what's on it. You don't decide how it's arranged on the plate. Your only choice is eat it or don't eat it. If you wave away one course, you'll still get the next one, but what you'll never get is any participation in the structure of the meal. That's how Pikmin 2 works. You can skip any sub-level of a cave if you want. It's a challenge sometimes to get to the exit, but the game never forces you to defeat all the enemies or pick up all the treasures before you leave. You have the freedom to say no to any specific challenge. Just like how at a banquet, you can refrain from eating one of the courses, but you can't get something else in its place. Now personally, I love eating food that other people have cooked, and I also love Pikmin 2. Just like with Metroid Prime 2, if you think that my being aware of its limitations is the same thing as disliking it, you're way off. Like Echoes, Pikmin 2 is actually my favorite game in the series, and the one I replay most often, although the original Pikmin is arguably more replayable in a strict sense, because it's shorter and gives you more freedom of choice. Pikmin 2 may not have been very faithful to its predecessor in terms of level design, but it doubled down on the personality and charm. Instead of writing down a single observation per day in his diary, in this game Olimar has remarks prepared for every single enemy creature you encounter, as well as every treasure and even plants and non-hostile animals like the honey wisps. He's a total chatterbox in this game, but that's a good thing, because he has funny and interesting things to say. And because it's optional, it doesn't come across as intrusive. I have spent hours reading this stuff, and even booted up the game with no intention of playing it, just so I could reread the Piklopedia on a completed save file. This is some of the best flavor text that has ever appeared in a video game. I mean it. And honestly, even without the Piklopedia, this game's enemies would still rank as exceptional. They have so many ways of trying to kill your Pikmin, so many intriguing quirks and behavior patterns that force you to think on your feet. I mentioned earlier that Pikmin 2 doesn't require much strategic thinking, but there's a difference between strategy and tactics. Strategy is large-scale decision-making, where you put your Pikmin to work, how many of each type you grow, what challenge you go after next, and so on. But tactics is the decision-making you do on the fly. How do I beat this one enemy? How do I get over this one obstacle? How do I dig up this one treasure? That kind of thing. And Pikmin 2 has tactical challenge out the wazoo. In that sense, it's actually a much more challenging game than the original. The difference is that it's a more immediate and less cerebral kind of challenge. In Pikmin 1, a bad decision is something like, oh, I forgot to unroll that bridge at the beginning of the day. Now I have to come back tomorrow for that ship part. In Pikmin 2, a bad decision is more like, oh, I forgot there was a bomb rock there. Now half of my Pikmin are dead. Pikmin 2 isn't worse than Pikmin, and it's not really easier either, but it's unquestionably a very different experience. If Pikmin fans were hoping for a sequel that scratched exactly the same itch as the original, only more so, there's no way they wouldn't be a little disappointed with the finished product. So it shouldn't be too surprising that there was some backlash, both inside and outside of Nintendo, to Pikmin 2's overall approach. Like I said earlier, Pikmin didn't have to innovate in order to stay popular, and it went ahead and innovated anyway, which ironically may have made it less popular. It's a little difficult to know exactly how well a video game does financially, but no matter which measurement you use, it's clear that Pikmin 2 did not sell as well as Pikmin. This is not a good sign. Remember that not only did both games come out for the same console, but Pikmin 2 had the advantage of coming out later, meaning there was a bigger install base of Gamecube owners who might have bought it. You would expect it to sell better than the original, and it didn't. A lot of people have wondered why Pikmin 3 took nearly a decade to come out when the first two games were released so quickly, and I have to wonder if the answer isn't practically staring us in the face. Pikmin 2 didn't make enough money. The original Pikmin was a surprise success because it was a new property, and it did pretty well. It's not like it outsold Mario or anything. But Pikmin 2, as its successor, was facing considerably higher expectations, and instead it did worse. For a lot of franchises, that would lead to outright cancellation, not massive developer interest in making a third installment. But wait, I hear you say. Metroid Prime 2 was in exactly the same boat. It sold worse than the original Prime, and sales for the Pikmin series aren't even that much lower than Prime's. So how come Prime 2 got a sequel just 3 years later? And to that I would respond, it's because Prime was a Metroid property. Metroid was and is one of Nintendo's classic franchises. They weren't going to stop making Metroid games just because one of them failed to meet sales expectations. Heck, even after they whiffed with 2 underperforming games in a row, they still wanted to make Prime 4. Metroid has the kind of clout that can protect it from the axe when times get tough. Pikmin doesn't. Another thing to remember is that it was Retro Studios working on the Prime series. They didn't have any other game projects to distract them, and they also thought of the series as a trilogy and were really good at pitching it as one. Meanwhile, Pikmin was an internal project, worked on by big talents like Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka. These guys could and did spend their time on other projects that presumably would make more money for Nintendo. And nobody, including the development team, thought of Pikmin as an epic trilogy that really needed a third installment. This was a series where the story was always on the back burner, more a matter of atmosphere than intense drama. In the end, I think the reason they eventually made Pikmin 3 wasn't because they had high hopes for its financial prospects, or because Pikmin 2 was crying out for a sequel. I think it's because Pikmin was originally Shigeru Miyamoto's brainchild, and he still felt responsible for it. More than anything else, it feels like he was dissatisfied with how Pikmin 2 turned out, and wanted to make a real Pikmin 2, which of course ended up being Pikmin 3. And Pikmin 3 would ultimately carry on 2 traditions of the Pikmin series. First, the strategic, open-ended gameplay that made the original game so distinctive, and second, the tradition of changing a bunch of stuff from the previous game when it didn't have to, thus unintentionally making a lot of fans hate it. I remember when Pikmin 3 first came out, one of its most ballyhooed features was the reintroduction of a mechanic that Pikmin 2 had controversially left out, even though many fans considered it essential to Pikmin: the time limit. That strict 30-day time limit made players of the original Pikmin think strategically, and kept them from settling into a comfortable routine. As a result, it gave the game a sense of tension that's notably lacking from Pikmin 2. It was obvious that Shigeru Miyamoto considered this a top priority when he started leading the development of Pikmin 3. Whatever else the game had, it needed to bring back that time limit in some form. I have to admit that their approach to this was pretty clever. In Pikmin 3, your captains are searching for fruits, whose seeds they can take back to their home planet to solve a hunger crisis brought on by overconsumption. For this same reason, their own supply of food is very limited, and they end up relying on the juice of these fruits to sustain themselves during their mission. There's no strict time limit in Pikmin 3. Instead, you're confronted with a dynamic time limit that changes depending on how well you're playing. Do a good job of finding and bringing back fruit, and you'll feel less pressure to hurry. Slack off, and you might come dangerously close to seeing your captains starve. It reintroduces that sense of urgency that was in the original game, while also occasionally forcing you to make some difficult decisions about where to go and what to do. There's one big problem with this, though. Finding and collecting fruit is an interesting gameplay hook, but it doesn't give the game any structure in the way that the collection mechanics of the previous two games did. In Pikmin, Olimar is collecting ship parts. Once his ship is fully repaired, he can leave the planet. In Pikmin 2, Olimar and Louie are collecting treasures to pay off their company's debt. Once the debt is paid off, the main game is finished and the post-game begins. Now let's look at Pikmin 3. How many fruits do the Kopaiites need to collect in order to save their planet? 10? 50? 800? There's no obvious answer. If it's just a matter of growing plants from seeds, they could arguably save their planet with just a single fruit, which would make for a pretty short game. But how do you justify to the player the need to collect any more fruit than this? The same open-endedness that makes the dynamic time limit interesting as a game mechanic also makes it useless for storytelling purposes, since your captains are only consuming juice so they can stay on a planet where they have nothing to do but collect more juice. Not only is there no obvious end state for a game where you do nothing but gather fruit, there's also no obvious way to introduce new areas for the player to explore. In Pikmin, the ship was able to fly farther as it gradually repaired itself with the parts you collected, which makes sense. In Pikmin 2, you specifically picked up treasures that contained microchips with data on them about other regions. And honestly, in retrospect, this is really contrived, but it gets the job done, I guess. The point is, you can't do this when the central collectible of the game is fruit. Fruit does not contain microchips. Fruit does not make spaceships work better. In the end, I'm pretty sure the developers realized that fruit was not going to be enough to hang a story off of. So the developers came up with another goal for the player. What Alf, Brittany, and Charlie are really trying to do in this game is find their ship's cosmic drive key, which is what allows their ship to reach escape velocity, and get off PNF 404 before they exhaust the juice supply they've been able to accumulate. This is what the game's actual structure is built on. It starts with the three captains becoming separated when their ship crash lands on the planet. Once they get back together, they find a data file that makes it look like Olimar has their cosmic drive key. They go looking for him and find Louie instead. Louie eventually leads them to Olimar. They rescue Olimar from a weird alien, and Olimar hands them the key. One thing you might notice about this story, aside from the fact that it's really simplistic, basically just a variation on the story from the original Pikmin, is that it also has nothing to do with fruit. Would it surprise you to know that in the many lines of dialogue in this game, there is almost no discussion about the fact that these three people are trying to save their home planet from starvation? That's the premise of the game, but the game itself isn't interested in it. Instead, the characters drone on and on about getting off the planet and finding their cosmic drive key and giving this Olimar person a talking to for stealing it from them. If this were more of a hands-off, non-linear experience like the original Pikmin, the banality of the story wouldn't be such a big deal. You could just ignore it and do the things you felt like doing. But the game will not let you ignore this crappy story. If you spend a day just collecting fruit, the ostensible point of this whole trip in the first place, instead of heading toward the next objective marker, the captains will whine, literally whine, about the fact that they aren't getting any closer to finding the cosmic drive key. Okay, so what if you just focus on advancing the plot and collect only as much fruit as you absolutely need? Will that make them happy? Nope. At the end of every day, Brittany will chime in about your current juice supply, and boy is she hard to please. Go a single day without collecting a fruit? She'll start fretting about it, even if you have 2 weeks worth of juice left. I swear, at one point in the game I had 60, count 'em, 60 bottles of juice stocked up, 2 months of food supplies, and Brittany's response was basically, Oh great, I guess we actually have a little bit of a juice buffer. It's like the developers expected you to do a mediocre job and programmed all the dialogue accordingly. The game never stops for a moment to acknowledge what you've accomplished. Instead, it's always dangling keys in front of you to goad you into getting to the next checkpoint faster. Waste less time. Be more efficient. Geez, you only have 10 days of juice left. Do you want Alf to starve to death? Because it kind of seems like you do. And nothing underlines this game's senseless obsession with efficiency more than how much it urges you to become an expert at multitasking. Odd as this may seem for a series of strategy games, a normal playthrough of either Pikmin or Pikmin 2 actually doesn't involve a lot of multitasking. Even though you can get things done faster by throwing a perfectly calculated number of Pikmin at a task and going somewhere else to do other things, the 30-day time limit isn't strict enough to ever force you to do this. It's perfectly feasible to look for ship parts one at a time and still have days to spare for the final boss. What's more, leaving Pikmin unattended is dangerous. In the original, their AI was awful, and without your guidance they would blunder into all kinds of obstacles, which means that at best they wouldn't be accomplishing anything, and at worst they would be dropping like flies. Multitasking in the original Pikmin was often reduced to the most basic and danger-free tasks, like knocking down walls and building bridges, things that didn't require you to do much strategic thinking. Basically, you would just drop a few Pikmin off and forget about them until you happened to circle back that way later. The strategy element was a lot more about when you chose to deal with various things using your main force of Pikmin. Pikmin 2 offered more in the way of multitasking challenges, since with 2 captains it was now possible to get things done at entirely different parts of the map. Certain puzzles and bosses basically required you to split up your forces and multitask, but when you think about it, if you have to do it, then it's not saving you any time. There's a big difference between multitasking as a solution to a single complicated problem and multitasking as a way of optimizing the solution of a lot of simple problems. And this second type of multitasking is what Pikmin 3 is full of. You can tell that as soon as the dev team came up with the idea for those pottery shard bridges, they fell in love, because they show up everywhere. But actually assembling the bridge is only half of it. You see, most of these bridges are made from several widely scattered piles of shards that you have to find and in some cases actually dig out of the ground. It's slow and tedious busy work, and the only real challenge involved with it is the nagging feeling that you ought to be getting something else done at the same time. This is the nasty trick that Pikmin 3 plays on you while you're playing it. If you don't multitask and just take things one slow step at a time, the game often feels boring and way too easy, not to mention the fact that the game keeps berating you for doing a bad job. If you do multitask, on the other hand, things can quickly spiral out of control. You lose Pikmin to enemies and hazards that you forgot were there, captains who are running on autopilot get blocked by obstacles you haven't cleared out yet. It's a nightmare. And the frustrating thing is that there's a lot of fun to be had in Pikmin 3, if only the game would just let you have it. The environments are gorgeous, just like in the original Pikmin, but with a lot more polish applied on top. The 30 different varieties of fruit scattered over the planet aren't quite as impressive as Pikmin 2's hundreds of treasures, but finding them is still generally interesting and a decent challenge. The new enemies are enjoyable to fight. Okay, scratch that. Most of the new enemies are enjoyable to fight, and the 2 new Pikmin types are really cool, especially the winged Pikmin, who are in my opinion the best addition to any Pikmin game ever. I eventually had a good time with Pikmin 3, but it was only after I decided to ignore all the messages the game was throwing at me and take the game at my own pace. Brittany and her obsessive-compulsive complaining be damned. It felt like I was fighting with the game to have fun, and even when you end up winning that kind of fight, it's not a good feeling to have. The dirty little secret of Pikmin 3 is that, for all that it pretends to recapture the exploratory feel of the original Pikmin, it's actually far more linear and confining than either of the previous 2 games when it comes to big important things that drive the story. You will fight the same sequence of bosses, in the same order, every time you play through Pikmin 3. You'll explore the various regions in a series of chunks that is 100% predictable. Garden of Hope Part 1, Distant Tundra, Tropical Wilds, Twilight River, Garden of Hope Part 2, Formidable Oak. I said before that Pikmin 2 is pretty linear up to about day 6, but in terms of major events, Pikmin 3 actually never stops being linear. This isn't a free-roaming adventure. It's a race to hit a bunch of predetermined checkpoints in the shortest number of days possible. It reminds me of how I felt while playing other games like Cuphead or Bioshock Infinite, games with beautiful graphics and worlds you just want to get lost in, but you can't because that's not the point. All 3 of these games combine a high amount of visual detail with game mechanics that deliberately tear you away from the visuals in the name of mechanical optimization. You try to enjoy what the game is giving you, and it smacks you on the head and says, "What are you doing? There are objectives to complete. Don't you want to get to the end as fast as possible so you can stop playing me and do something else? In an attempt to add strategy and tension back to the series, Miyamoto and his team ran the risk of throwing away, or at least rendering irrelevant, everything else that makes it special. As big a departure as Pikmin 2 was from the original game, it still clung to that spark of charm and personality that made its mechanics worth engaging with in the first place. Pikmin 3 loosened its grip on that while chasing after something else, and in the process it came damn close to losing it. I'll probably play Pikmin 3 again. For all its faults, it's still a fun game, and honestly, it's also really easy for the most part, which makes it more replayable. But its failing in my eyes is that these are the biggest compliments I can give it. Pikmin is, after all, a series marked by constant evolution, always getting bigger and better, more captains, more enemy creatures, more complicated level design. By all rights, I should be able to say that Pikmin 3 is the best Pikmin game. And it's not. This isn't a Prime Trilogy situation where I frankly believe that all three games are a match for each other in terms of quality. Pikmin and Pikmin 2 are that way. Pikmin 3 is good, but definitely falls short of them. And that, at least for the moment, closes the book on the Pikmin franchise. Like I said, that closes the book. The book is closed. Those three games. That's it. Whew. So the question is, where does Pikmin go from here? How will Nintendo keep things fresh in the next installment? After all, even though the Switch port of Pikmin 3 was a big financial success, the actual game came out nearly a decade ago. Nintendo isn't in a position to release a safe retread of any of the previous games and expect it to sell. Not that they did do that, even when they were in a position to, back when Pikmin 2 came out. As I was writing the script for this video, Nintendo released its first promotional video for 2023, and the big opener was a 3-minute trailer heralding the upcoming release of Pikmin 4. This trailer, as trailers do, showed us brief glimpses of many intriguing things. Pikmin freezing a small pond so the captains could walk across it, a weird alien dog-like creature with an unpronounceable name, the first blonde in Pikmin history, and so on. A lot of people are taking what we see in this trailer as evidence that this new game is returning to the more easygoing, time-limitless approach of Pikmin 2. I would be happy to see the return of collectible treasures and caves with sublevels to the series, but at the same time I'm pretty sure, based on the path that Pikmin has taken up to now, that caves as we know them aren't coming back. Pikmin is a franchise that has always reveled in bold experiments and big changes. The original game was so good at what it did that Nintendo could totally have been excused if they decided to just milk it from then on. For better or for worse, what they actually did was the opposite. Pikmin 2 was not a safe retread of Pikmin, and despite the return of the time limit in Pikmin 3, that game actually turned out to be radically different from both of its predecessors. Ironically, for Pikmin 4 to live up to the tradition of this franchise, it has to make its own way without falling back on old paradigms. I have no doubt that there will be caves in it, but if my guess is correct, they're not going to be anything like the compartmentalized, combat-focused caves of Pikmin 2. And don't forget, most of the content shown in that trailer took place out in the open, including an outdoor scene at night, which really would be a huge departure for the series. This isn't just what I expect, it's what I'm hoping for. Pikmin 3 would have been more fun for me if it had been less innovative, but that would also make it less interesting to talk about. I admire the team for continuing to take risks, even when I don't particularly like the result. After all, if they stopped innovating and started playing it safe, they might reliably turn out an 8 out of 10 game every time. But that would mean giving up on the possibility of ever making a 10 out of 10 game again. And who wants that? There are plenty of safe, unambitious video game series out there. Pikmin doesn't have to be one of them, and it never has been before. Pikmin really is the little franchise that could. It started off very small and humble, with only its quirky and offbeat charm to recommend it in a world full of established franchises that it had no chance of outperforming. It's never been a massive success, but it's also never flopped, never compromised, and never stopped getting new installments, even if they do take a long time to get made. It keeps going because the people who make it believe in it. They think they can keep things fresh and new with each game that comes out, and so far they've been right. In less than half a year, we'll see the fruits of their latest effort. I can't tell you what that game will be like, or whether I'll think it's better or worse than any of the previous Pikmin games. This series is just too unpredictable for that. But I can tell you one thing. I'm looking forward to it.